Our next speaker served on President Obama's Arts Policy Committee. She has been profiled in Vogue and is currently the Dubois Fellow at Harvard University. In researching and writing her latest book, The Rise: Creativity, the Gift of Failure, and the Search for Mastery, she discovered that privacy and a safe place to work are vital to the creation of great art. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Sarah Walker.
Hi. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. All right, I'm thrilled to be here. I told my goddaughter, who is around 5 years old, I was coming to this conference, and she thought I said a conference on pirates and creativity, and she sent me this beautiful drawing, and I thought, oh, sooner and later in life she'll learn more about privacy and its crucial role in innovation, and that is what I'm here to speak about today. And I'd like to begin by telling you a brief story. About a century ago, downtown in New York City, Washington Square, a painter was at work on an invention that would change our world. He was NYU's first professor of painting. He spent 26 years with the ambition to rival a Michelangelo, a Raphael, a Titian. But there in that studio, he considered destroying every canvas on which he'd ever laid his brush. He encountered every imaginable type of critique. He couldn't support his family, sent them to live in New Haven, where the cost of living was lower, and he remained in New York, but ultimately felt, as he put it, jilted by his art. This painter was Samuel Morse, and he converted the stretcher bars of one of his failed canvases into the model of the telegraph. This telegraph now sits on loan from the Smithsonian in the Oval Office at the White House. Because it's difficult to imagine it now, but at the time, this lightning line, as it was called, was seen as an unprecedented discovery and, as many journalists put it, the greatest achievement of the human mind. News that used to take 2 weeks to travel, as the news of the signing of the Declaration of Independence did, now was instantaneous. Morse, though, spent years tinkering with this telegraph model without wanting anyone to see it. He only showed it to a few trusted relatives and a few stalwart students, and only uncloaked it when he thought someone might beat him to the punch and have their model of the telegraph win out. I mention this story because Morse is describing a timeless feature of creativity that I'd like to speak about more today. I wrote about this internal landscape of creative individuals as I penned this book entitled The Rise: Creativity, the Gift of Failure, and the Search for Mastery. I think this is an earlier version when the subtitle was different. And I realized that there are many different stories that often display how uncommon the foundation is of someone's iconic rise. I'll tell you a few examples. I learned, for example, that Duke Ellington said about his legendary music, "I merely take the energy it takes to pout, and I write some blues." I learned that Paul Taylor, the dancer and choreographer, had his early, now iconic style so panned that the reviewer left the newsprint completely blank. Right. It was so minimalist, the reviewer said, well, if Louis Horst Paul Taylor won't dance, I won't write, and he left it simply this way. Many stories. Thomas Edison told his assistant, incredulous of the inventor's repeated attempts to invent the incandescent light bulb, "I have not failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work." I learned about all these different private experiences that rarely come to light. The 1930s RKO screen test said at one point, can't sing, can't act, balding, can dance a little, and this was in reference to Fred Astaire. I learned that Martin Luther King received in seminary C's in a transcript of A's and B's in, can you guess what class? In public speaking. Not once, but twice. C plus, then C. When it was worse. And this private story has rarely come to light. We hear about more of these private stories at commencement time, when speakers who have reached a pinnacle of success finally feel comfortable revealing the true arc and journey that brought them to that stage. So it's then that, for example, J.K. Rowling, when she went to Harvard in 2008, spoke about what she called the fringe benefits of failure. She spoke about how rock bottom for her became the solid foundation on which she built her rise. And Oprah Winfrey went to Harvard again and spoke about the importance of failure. As I had some distance from writing this book, I realized that all of these individuals, despite their different journeys, displayed a central, crucial trait. They were all able to see something before it happened. Like Samuel Morse, they were able to see that this crude contraption could become the start of the communications revolution. And what that required was a safe haven, a private domain to protect themselves from iconoclastic, premature critique. Now, it sounds very simple, this idea, but I think at this moment there is urgency to speak about it. As a former curator at MoMA and the Tate Modern and faculty member at Yale School of Art, I'm often asked by young artists of all kinds, how do I get my work discovered? How can I get seen? There's such a trend for people to get their work out there on various platforms, Instagram, YouTube, you name it. And what it means is that we are losing, I believe, our sense and instinct to understand a timeless feature of the creative process. Showing your work too early can help you find an audience, but being too conscious of your audience can unhinge you from your own creative self. In other words, creativity has a growth pattern to it. As in life, it starts with an embryonic stage. Artists of all kinds understand this instinctively. In a recent interview that Chris Rock gave to Vulture magazine, he lamented the fact that smartphones and comedy clubs have meant that well-known comedians have few chances to practice new material. In other words, the rehearsal space has become too public too early. Duran Duran, the keyboardist Nick Rhodes, spoke about this in much the same way, thinking back nostalgically on the 1980s when bands could develop organically in front of an audience without fear of their sort of near-win work making it to the public stage prematurely. I learned this the hard way myself when I was writing a chapter of The Rise. I showed my editor a section on a then lesser-known figure who I'd come to know in Silicon Valley. His name is Travis Kalanick, and he was starting a sort of taxi company of sorts. He went on to become the CEO of Uber, and by revealing this chapter too early in an embryonic stage, I lost 6 months of work and was really paralyzed by the premature critique. While Travis Kalanick's revelations are still in The Rise, I think of that salient moment as a sort of detonation for me in understanding this idea. Thankfully, alongside writing The Rise, I had read every interview I could find in the Paris Review, the legendary journal that has interviewed nearly every artist, author, creative person that you can imagine. I made this insane chart of the key features that each individual discussed was crucial for their process, from Maya Angelou to Ray Bradbury. And private domains ranked high on this chart, in this list. Maya Angelou, for example, would mention that no matter what city she was in, even if she had a home there and she wanted to create, she would rent a hotel room. All she needed was that hotel room, a good dictionary, and a bottle of sherry. She would get there at 5 in the morning without fail and would work until noon, and then would re-enter the world, pretend to be normal, as she would put it. Ray Bradbury's process was much the same. Susan Sontag has this process in which she refuses lunch dates, even with close friends, in order to maintain the privacy required for creativity. Perhaps the most famous example comes from the image of Albert Einstein's office here in 1955 on the last day of his life at the Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton. Einstein described his office here and prior ones as the, quote, worldly cloister where he hatched his most beautiful ideas. But that term, worldly cloister, hints at the paradox of creativity. It reminds us of this. Putting something out into the world requires a temporary removal from it. I started to realize that these private domains have nothing to do with actual space. They're about cultivating a space within ourselves, a space where we can shield ourselves from our own overgrown inner critics. Our bodies remind us of this even when we forget. Just consider what happens in the mind when jazz musicians improvise. Alan Braun and my friend and colleague Charles Lim at Johns Hopkins have a study about this. They invited musicians to improvise a piece of music and then also to play a piece of memorized music while hooked up in an fMRI imaging scanner. What they found is that during improvisation, areas of the musician's brain involved with self-expression lit up, and those involved with self-judgment were suppressed. That is to say, when musicians are improvising, the brain is offering them a private space that is protected from their own inner critic. In fact, the closest the brain comes to this state is in the REM state of dreaming, when we have no one to fear and our ideas are completely our own. Why is this so important? Well, when the mind barricades itself from critique, we have the permission to put out into the world our iconoclastic ideas. There are many different domains that have benefited from creating a structure for employees or colleagues to reap the benefits of this sort of innovation. Think about this in the context of science labs and then the entertainment industry and Hollywood. Recently, the Nobel Prize was won by two men, Andrei Geim and Konstantin Novoselov in the UK, who are known for a practice in their laboratory of what they call Friday night experiments. Times where they permit themselves, in this sort of safety of this safe haven, to ask questions that experts wouldn't dare. From it, they were allowed to retain the sort of curiosity of the child, free from sort of the shame that this bracketed time allowed for. And during this period, they asked themselves, curious about two-dimensional objects and carbon and graphite being used to discover it, whether or not something as simple as Scotch tape and the graphite hanging out in an ordinary pencil could be the key to discovering it. They took out of a waste bin the Scotch tape and graphite hanging out there from a related experiment, put it under the microscope, and found that they had the thinnest recorded attempt on record. Over the 16-month period, they sort of fancied up this technique, had their findings rejected by the preeminent journal Nature, which is such a frequent occurrence for innovation. It should be an unintended compliment. Andrei Geim loves recounting this story. He did so when he won the Nobel Prize and gave his speech. And in the interview, he said, about my work, he said, sometimes I say I don't research, I only search. What's required for that, the difficult journey that allows for, is being able to summon the courage to be iconoclastic and the play that lets us remain supple and nimble enough to go on that journey. Andrei Geim and Konstantin Novoslov are known, in effect, for being deliberate amateurs, right? Formidable men, playful men, deliberate amateurs. And the way to allow this to be possible in their laboratory is by having a structured time, a private space, in order to harness the gains from that mode of thought. Many other organizations have analogous examples. Google's 20% time, in effect, is a Friday night experiment time, and there are many others. But the most vivid example for me comes from Hollywood. We may never have seen these films, Juno, Slumdog Millionaire, and Lars and the Real Girl, if not for the private domain created by the Blacklist. This is not the communist Blacklist or the HBO show The Blacklist, but a document, the very artful setup that a man named Franklin Leonard created when he was working at Leonardo DiCaprio's production company. He wanted to find excellent screenplays, unusual documents, and found it difficult. Because every year, the Writers Guild of America states that there are 50,000 new screenplays. And if you did nothing but read screenplays all year long, you could get through about 1,000. So he decided to harness the minds and power of his friends to identify new properties. So he wrote anonymously to 85 colleagues, please tell me the screenplays that you secretly love, but that you don't think will be in theaters in the next year, and that you think might not have a chance of really getting made. Nearly all did as they were asked, and Franklin tabulated the answers in a document via Excel, sorted by the amount of votes or mentions that each screenplay received. And then, it was 2005, he went on vacation and turned off his phone, as he could then, came back and saw that this document had gone viral in Hollywood. Development truly stopped that day, as people saw that films that were seen as failed documents had been recast as ones to watch. Films like Things We Lost in the Fire, Juno, Lars and the Real Girl. Films that were nominated for Academy Awards that year. From this annual document, which has become now a Netflix-like rolling list, we also received The King's Speech. David Seidler told me, he was 74 when he wrote this, that it was his last will and testament, but he didn't dare shop it around Hollywood. His son told him that no one would want to watch a film about a man stuttering the entire time, so he didn't even try. Instead, it was going to be a humble television production until it landed on what's called the Brit List. This has become so impactful for Hollywood. There's a British version. It then landed on the Blacklist the following year. Harvey Weinstein saw it, and you know what happened next. It was made for $15 million. It grossed $500 million. It was nominated for 12 Academy Awards, of which it won 4, including Best Original Screenplay. Woody Allen bested the record for the oldest person to win in that category, which set up this joking rivalry between David Seidler and Woody Allen. David told me, I said to Woody, last one to win an Oscar over 100 is a rotten egg, he said. But why is this list so impactful? Well, what it really did was create a way for iconoclastic decisions to come to light in Hollywood. Hollywood is like many industries in which the Ash experiment is constantly going on. The Ash experiment was executed in the 1950s by Solomon Ash, and he effectively found that there's something even worse than peer pressure at work when people are faced with an innovative idea in a group context. He asked subjects a simple question. In isolation, they all gave the right answer to the question, which line on the left is equivalent to the line on the right? 95% of the time, you'll all tell me line 2. But when he asked subjects to still give the correct answer, but had paid off a set of other subjects who were giving the wrong answer, the correct response rate dropped to 25%. It's almost unconscionable, unimaginable. People replicated this experiment for years and did so in the same year that the blacklist came out. Neuroeconomist Gregory Burns replicated it and again put subjects in an fMRI scanner to see what is in fact going on when we give up on our own correct view. And effectively what he found is that this isn't simply about peer pressure. The body pays a price when we're going against a group opinion and are perceiving ourselves in that moment of being a dissenter. He found that the amygdala is activated in these moments, the fear or fight or flight sensation that happens to us in certain circumstances happens in that moment. But most importantly, when he asked subjects if they knew they were giving up on the obvious correct answer, they did not. How many times have you been in a meeting and perhaps suppressed the innovative idea that in fact would have helped you, your organization, your company? The Asch experiment is at work in Hollywood as it has to adjudicate between properties. Which film will make it based on a past metric of success? And without knowing it, these executives oftentimes were not advocating for unusual films like Lars and the Real Girl, and if you know the plot for that movie, you know why it might be difficult to say to your colleagues, I really believe in this film. In some ways, it shouldn't be so surprising that we need these private domains for the creation of art, because after all, creative works that move us inevitably create a private domain in us. Thomas Jefferson said it best. He stood in front of a painting and wrote to his friend about it. It fixed me like a statue, a quarter of an hour or half an hour. I do not know which, for I lost all ideas of time, even the consciousness of my own existence. A private space develops in us where we can summon the bravery to see the world differently, to go against popular opinion. Frederick Douglass talked about this during the Civil War, as did the legendary constitutional lawyer Charles Black, who remembered being in Austin, Texas one day in 1931 and saw this trumpet player, Louis Armstrong, who so impressed him with his genius, although he'd never heard of him before, that he knew segregation must be wrong. He knew in that moment that he was going to walk towards justice, as he did, becoming one of the first lawyers for Brown versus Board of Education. At Columbia and Yale, where he went on faculty, he held an annual Armstrong Listening Night to honor that inner space that shifted in him and that ultimately shifted our world. So I would say that while we are in a place of encouraging transparency regarding creativity, it's not unusual or wrong-headed to look at the importance of privacy as a way of understanding how new ideas are executed. In many cases, privacy has been the only way that we've created the innovative ideas that we are honored to celebrate. Thank you.